Judges, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Steve Frenzik, a retired professor of political science from the U.S. Naval Academy. Oh, you're muted, Candy.
Sorry. I'm Candida Steele, and I'm retired as a judge on the U.S. Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, and I live in Maine.
Lindsay Draper, retired from the juvenile court bench here in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin.
And would you introduce yourselves?
Good afternoon or good morning, judges. We are Unit 6 from Grant High School representing Oregon. My name is Neil Elmore.
Hi, I'm Denali Williams.
My name is Ethan Varga.
Hello, I'm Sophia Zambelli.
My name is Kyle Napati, and we are here with our teacher, Ms. Di Pasquale.
Well, thank you. As you know, we're doing Unit 6, question number 1. In a letter to Daniel Shays from Benjamin Lincoln, he said, "Disband your deluded followers. Should you attempt to fire upon the troops of government, the consequences might be fatal to many of your men, the least guilty." What purpose, if any, have rebellions served throughout American history? Do the events of January 6, 2021 at the US Capitol constitute a rebellion? Why or why not? Are there rebellions in the world today that are justified? Why or why not? You may begin.
Surrender and take an oath of allegiance to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or face the potentially fatal consequences. That's what General Benjamin Lincoln wrote Captain Daniel Shay and his followers in 1787. The Confederation government had denied Revolutionary War veterans wages, yet creditors still sought payment and seizure of the veterans' land. Lincoln's threat proved true. 4 of Shay's men died during the Arsenal attack, and 2 more were executed. In reaction to this unsuccessful rebellion, leaders such as George Washington sought a stronger national government, which was realized in the Constitutional Convention, and it adverted useful purpose. The rebellion of the Confederacy also achieved the unintended consequence of helping America achieve the founding values of the Declaration of Independence, with the additions of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
One useful purpose of rebellions is to speak truth to power. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was an attempt to destroy the institution of slavery. It became a catalyst for the Civil War. The 1946 Battle of Athens in Tennessee saw Sheriff Mansfield detain XGI poll watchers, beat them, and seize ballot boxes, all so that he could perpetrate electoral fraud. Citizens' complaints to the U.S. Department of Justice went unanswered. The battle caused the downfall of the sheriff, and a more democratic regime resulted.
We do not know if the events which transpired on January 6th constitute a rebellion because we do not know the end of the story. We define a rebellion as a revolt against civil authority that includes organization, a goal of replacing the political system, and a movement beyond a single event. As of now, we know January 6th can be classified as an insurrection, a single act of violently revolting against the civil authority by the people to overthrow the government and establish themselves in power. Former President Trump caused this insurrection by trumpeting false claims of a stolen election. Many of those who participated in the insurrection felt called to engage. Leaders like Senators Hawley and Cruz urged their supporters to stop the steal, to take back the White House. For January 6th to be classified as a rebellion, we still need to know the greater goal of the insurrection, currently under investigation by the January 6th Committee in the Department of Justice. These investigations are essential because, in the words of John Locke, whoever lays the foundation for overturning the Constitution in frame of any just government is highly guilty of the greatest crime.
But we agree with John Locke that it is just for people to revolt against oppression. Rebellion is justified when the people have no recourse for their grievances and they have suffered a long train of abuses. All that is left is to revolt. Recent Iranian protests continue to be fueled by governmental corruption and greed. The general population is left to suffer and is justified in demanding a new government. But not every rebelling group has been historically oppressed and is not justified. The ongoing Tigrayan War in Ethiopia is an example of one group fighting to maintain disproportionate control of their country.
Separatist movements in Cameroon and Nigeria have taken a different approach. As Albert Camus said, retaliation is related to nature and instinct, not to law. Law, by definition, cannot obey the same rules as nature. Looking to their national leaders for health and security, they got nothing. That failure moved them to form separate governments. The continued failure of the existing governments justifies their attempts to break away, echoing the American Revolution, which birthed our own nation. Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
Put yourself in the place of the most violent demonstrators from January 6th and give us an idea in terms of how they might justify their behavior to their children and grandchildren.
They believed that this election was on the basis of fraud. Former President Donald Trump continuously stated that he had won the election and that there were votes that had been lost or taken away from him that resulted in him inaccurately losing the election. And this spread of information across news platforms through the alt-right groups resulted in them believing this truly.
John Locke said in the second treatise that in the law of nature, people have the rights to life, liberty, and property. And that when we enter into a social contract, the citizens have the right to instigate a revolution if they believe the government was not acting in their interests. I believe that the January 6th insurrectionists sincerely felt that their liberty had been infringed upon because they believed on basis claims that the election had been stolen, and that's how they justified their action.
I would like to argue that they might not actually be able to justify their actions to their children or grandchildren. One of those who were charged with seditious conspiracy out of the 8 total insurrectionists that were charged with seditious conspiracy actually was shown in court to have threatened his children in saying that they could not disclose any information regarding his participation in this insurrection. So I think that in a way, many of the insurrectionists knew that what they did was not justified, and they were willing to threaten their own family members to keep it hush.
Not wanting to move too far from that, and I apologize for butting in here.
Oh, fine.
One of the concerns that I have is that I look at this as the childish behavior of people who refuse to admit that they lost. When I was a child, if I lost, I almost always said they cheated. And that seems to be what is happening. And what worries me is if we don't go ahead and call it what it is, then aren't we setting ourselves up for having every time people don't like the result, them saying this was a steal? We have the right to rebel.
I agree with you. I think it was childish behavior to not admit that they had lost the election. However, their beloved political leader was saying that it was a stolen election and calling for action and calling to fight like hell.
Yes, I believe that former President Donald Trump really, at the beginning of his presidency, released the lid on what was acceptable with violence and hate speech. And this is shown through his entire presidency. And then, of course, at the insurrection itself.
And this is one of the things that former President Trump was a genius in. He was brilliant at seeding doubts in elites and government officials in order to forward his own political campaign.
But also, when we're talking,
That's okay, go ahead.
when we're talking about an event like January 6th, an insurrection, which is a direct attack on our democracy, it is what happens when the rule of law is broken. So this is not just a simple ball game that was lost. This is a part of our democracy and something that we cannot just say was cheated without legitimate facts and trust in the legislative process.
Another example of
Can I,
Okay,
if I
we
could just
need
jump into the new
to
question?
move on to another question.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I'll do that now. Do you think Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is implicated as a result of January 6th?
So recently, Judge Amy Totenberg of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia denied a preliminary injunction by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, allowing for a group of Georgian voters to proceed in a legal battle, trying to have Representative Greene removed from the ballot for this upcoming election based on the treason clause of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I think that it's extremely important that this happens, as the treason clause is what prevents those who aid or abet rebellion or insurrection against the government from being able to run again, and it's extremely important that those are punished. However, I also think it's important to recognize that the claims against Marjorie Taylor Greene are based on her speech, and as we know, based on Brandenburg v. Ohio, speech that incites her speech would have had to incite imminent lawless action, which would have been January 6th, for her to prove the burden that she caused or was involved in the insurrection.
So are you suggesting I'm sorry, are you suggesting that we or the plaintiffs might not prevail?
I am suggesting that.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, there's also, as you see in Title 18 USC 2383, it says, when it talks about rebellion and insurrection, it says those who obeyed or participate in any form of rebellion or insurrection can be jailed, fined, and cannot participate in hold any seat in our government. And we also see this in the Title 18 US Code 2381 about treason, which actually still states that treason can be punishable in addition to fines, jails, and no longer participating in our government with death.
Thank you.
What alternatives are there to rebellion if you want to change or alter government?
Well, the First Amendment's right to petition, assembly, press, and speech is a fair game to use as a protest. For example, we saw in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, Dr. King and other civil rights leaders led the Birmingham Children's Crusade, the March from Selma to Montgomery, and even recently the Black Lives Matter protest using those First Amendment rights.
Another example would be Greta Thunberg and how she used disobedience across the world to create change in legislation, especially in Germany, in regards to environmental justice.
Also, the right to vote. With our 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendment rights, we can use the right to vote to change the trajectory of the country through the system.
Going back to what my colleague Denali was saying, civil disobedience was one of Dr. King's core principles. He believed was the most effective strategy during the civil rights movement to obtain rights. The Montgomery bus boycotts, the lunch counter sit-ins were prime examples of citizens obtaining rights through civil disobedience by drawing attention to the prejudices that they face in a nonviolent way.
Building off of civil disobedience, in his letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King wrote in favor of civil disobedience, saying that there are 4 steps for civil disobedience: collection of the facts, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. He specifically focused on direct action, stating that there had been a long enough train of abuses that occurred against African Americans in the United States that direct action was required to initiate change, as long as the protesters respected the rule of law and accepted their consequences.
So if I were to posit to you that I don't believe that any of the things, the Montgomery bus boycott, the sit-ins at counters, would work now, because we as a people don't have the patience to let things have their impact. And for that reason, we see violence respond when we don't get our way. Would you agree or disagree with me?
I would say that the violence we're kind of seeing now has kind of all surrounded the individual's right to bear arms. Many of these armed protests have like armed weapons like AK-47. And I would kind of take this back to what the founders believed when they were writing the Constitution, and that the individuals did not really possess the individual right to bear arms, but they had the option to bear arms if they were willing to participate in an armed militia to stand against the government army.
I would slightly disagree with you in the fact that I think it has less to do with patience and more to do with outcome and media spread. Shootings and violence get a lot more media attention than peaceful protests. We saw recently in New York, scientists from NASA trying to tell everyone that in 3 years we will have irreversible damage. And this got very little large, widespread media attention versus violence, which is spread everywhere and can have a larger impact that way.
Adding on to that, in the summer of 2020, the massive BLM protests, 96% were peaceful, whereas 4% were not peaceful. And those 4% got a majority, or a large portion, of the media attention because of that.
Thank you.
When, if ever, should freedom of expression be limited?
You read what I was about to. Thank you, Steve.
Well, in the case of Warby Brock against racism, the government reasoned that freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly can be limited if it goes against a significant government interest. And in response, local governments and state governments can enact narrowly tailored legislation in order to make sure that not to suppress the people's voices, but allow for the government to continue
working.
And as we've seen in the Sedition Act of 1918 during World War I, freedom of expression was limited in that people could not express their dislike against what the United States Army was doing at the time. So it has been limited in the past.
Is violence ever acceptable during a protest?
Well, philosophers such as John Locke in his second treatise, section 11, he would say that those who sheddeth blood by man shall his blood be shed. So blood for blood, if one man kills someone, then another man can kill the man who killed the person.
Time.
Thank you very
Great
much.
job.
Good job by everyone. I thought you were good in terms of defining your terms. I thought that you had lots of examples. Your responses were timely in terms of what's going on in the world today. So overall, I thought you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So did I. I thought that was a beautiful job. I appreciated very much that you understood and addressed the 14th Amendment Section 3 issues. I hope you've had a good time here. Have you enjoyed this experience?
Yes,
Because
very much
you-
so, yeah.
you're right there at the cream of the crop. You know, you're the best minds we've got in your generation, and I hope that you will take this experience and not just be stunning citizens yourselves, but will influence those around you and encourage them to read the newspapers and watch their computers and stream their information and be good voters themselves. But more than that, I hope you'll consider representing the rest of us in some fashion or other in local or state or federal government, elected or working for the governments, because we desperately need people who know what government is supposed to be doing for us all. And if you were fulfilling some of those roles, I'll sleep better in my nursing home. So thank you. You've done a really lovely job, and it's been a pleasure to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the really fun things about getting the opportunity to judge competition such as this is hearing young people, and I don't want to say surprise you, because that implies that you wouldn't be in a position to do it. That's like I didn't expect it. But when you pull in things that I wasn't really expecting to hear, the discussion about the fact that the vast majority of the George Floyd generated protests were quite peaceful and had a specific message to get across, but you had coverage of the ones where somebody acted like the town fool. And I just happen to have a very close friend who talks about the protesters every time he wants to talk about violence. And that resonated so much with me. The question that I asked, I wasn't really expecting to hear about AK-47s, but it was an interesting spin on the question. And and sort of, you know, one of the things that said to me is, well, first off, you need to be very exact, but also don't assume that everybody's going to answer what you expect them to. You did that to me a couple of times during the course of your presentation, and that was so cool. I so much enjoyed listening to you. You really are good. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.